In the case of Palestine, as we're discussing here, what I'm hearing from Mark and Shabbos is a complete lack of awareness. The Palestinians are living under a brutal military occupation. Either you recognize that or you don't. If you don't recognize that, you're going to have continued disaster for the entire region and continued misery, foremost for the Palestinian people. If you recognize, as most of the world does, pretty much the entire world, with the exception of the US and Israel, the Palestinians have been living under one of the most brutal, longest military occupations in the world and have been denied their basic rights. If you don't recognize that, you're not going to solve the problem. And Trump's so-called peace plan does nothing to address that. When it comes to the issue of Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood, there's one line. It says, we recognize Palestinian self-determination and statehood as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. If you recognize something as an aspiration, but not as a right, you have no obligation to grant it. And the message from Israel, if you listen to Netanyahu, is that there will be no recognition. And he has the full backing of the US in that. And that's not just a Trump thing. This has been bipartisan US policy for decades to reject the one thing that could solve all this is grant Palestinians their minimal right to freedom. And so in that context, people want to make this about Hamas and how they have no right to be there. This isn't about Hamas. Even if Palestinians are the most pragmatic, docile people in the world, Israel would still insist, as they always have, on their self-declared right to steal their land because it's a Jewish supremacist state. Until that's resolved, you're going to have perpetual conflict. Here's my problem with your argument is that you're presuming two things I think are false. One is that Israel is a normal country like other states. And two, that there's parity here. Israel is not a country living in peace with its neighbors, and the Palestinians just disrupted all that on October 7th. Israel was waging on October 6th one of the most brutal and longest running military occupations in the world, which it refused to end, which it had multiple opportunities to do. And contrary to the revisionism we've heard in this interview from people like Shabbos, that the Palestinians were offered this great peace deal and they turned it down. No, Israel's never risen to the level of offering Palestinians the absolute minimum, which is a contiguous state in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, which, by the way, as I pointed out, Hamas has accepted. Listen, we can go into that record. There's a great new book by Robert Malley I have here. He worked for Bill Clinton. He was his negotiator. And he points out that what Bill Clinton said is just not true. Palestinians were never offered that. That's why Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was Ehud Barak's foreign minister, who you spoke to earlier, who was at Camp David when that so-called generous offer was made, Shlomo Ben-Ami said, if I were Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well. Because contrary to all the spin, including from people like Bill Clinton, Palestinians were never offered a contiguous state in the West Bank and Gaza. They were offered a Bantustan state where they could live in little cantons surrounded by major Israeli settlement blocks that make Palestinian life impossible. And even Hamas, if you look at their charter, they revised their charter. I wish they'd been even more forthcoming than they were, but the fact is they were more accommodating on the issue of the two-state solution than any Israeli across the spectrum. Are Palestinians offered any path to self-determination in this plan? No. All it says is we recognize this as your aspiration, which is like telling a starving person, I recognize that you're hungry and you aspire to have some food. We're not going to actually offer you any. And that's what this plan is. That sounds extreme to me. It sounds extreme to put people under one of the most brutal military occupations in the world and longest running and say, you have no path to your own freedom. And that has been the premise of all this. And so just going back to your original point to me, in terms of what Israel should have done on October 7th, again, we're not talking about a normal situation of neighbors living side by side and one person attacks another. You're talking about an occupied people, desperate, under siege forever. They've tried nonviolent protest. They've tried to accept the two-state solution. Nothing works. October 7th was an act of desperation. In terms of what Israel should have done, Israel didn't have the right to fire a single bullet into Gaza. It had the obligation to end the occupation and the siege and then negotiate a peace that recognizes Palestinians'
Yeah, but that's why we
rights to
disagree, because
self-determination.